Jefferson's intentions were ambitious, and he indicated at the time an intense desire to build a practical collection that chronicled all of human endeavor. He acquired large numbers of books across the range of subjects. Accumulating this number of books in the 18th century is no small undertaking, especially in America. The availability of suitable stock was certainly an issue, as was the expense, even for somebody with Jefferson's means, shaky as it might be at times. We do know, however, that Jefferson began to acquire books in earnest, though modestly, when he was a student, once he started at William and Mary in 1760. Off and on over the next 7 years, while doing coursework and later law school, Jefferson obtained books from the offices of the Virginia Gazette in Williamsburg, a natural place for one to pick up paper products if you want to see them that way in that period of time. In 1765, for example, in a particular year, he acquired 32 titles, this is as a student, and predictably covered every title that you would later find in a Jefferson collection. Law, history, works in Italian, dictionaries, poetry, always bad poetry except for Milton, Young and Shenstone, and a very particular poor taste in poetry, classical literature, agriculture, and as we recently witnessed in Washington, in 1765 acquired his copy of the English translation of the Quran. This was the Quran that was recently used to swear in Representative Ellison from Minnesota 3 years ago now. By 1773, Jefferson had already amassed a library of more than 1,250 titles. These books came from all sorts of sources. Beyond the predictable European outlets, Jefferson obtained books from collectors and collections nearby, Richard Bland, Peyton Randolph, several faculty of William and Mary. He even managed to be the person who acquired the books that were left behind by the royal governor when he fled Virginia. That's the kind of collector he was. And of course, when he went to Philadelphia, a whole new market of book buying opened up for him when he went to the Continental Congress. 10 years later, Jefferson's library numbered 2,640. He had already doubled the size of his endeavor. This was not accidental. It wasn't random, and I would argue that we've already left behind the notion of Jefferson as a collector. Jefferson is building a library. Jefferson gave every indication that his collection was built according to a plan, so much so that when he departed the following year for Europe, he looked forward to greatly expanding his library once again and had numerous lists and bibliographies created and ready to go, many of them, in fact, created with his bibliographic cohort, James Madison. And in fact, when Jefferson first arrived in Europe, much of the buying he was doing was in fact sending crates of books back to Madison, many of which became quite influential later in the writing of the Federalist Papers. Jefferson here is beginning to shape a notion of subject around his collection, and these lists become the beginnings of subject classification, if you will, within Jefferson's collection. Jefferson spent 5 years in Paris, a period of time that was fundamentally important to his collection. To Jefferson, the French were more advanced in science and philosophical undertakings than, say, the English. His own academic training led him to this. His own predilections as a Francophile certainly reinforced this. And it certainly informed his book buying experiences while he was in Paris. So when Jefferson arrived in France with a book catalog of his own books and a desiderata list of the books that he wanted to acquire, he was ready to buy, and he was ready to buy the Enlightenment. While this certainly served to expand his coverage of European topics, his buying had a dramatic effect, most importantly, on his Americana holdings. Remember, in the 18th century, a good portion of what we would describe as Americana is in fact not American imprints, but European imprints, many of them very hard to come by in America. So among other things, Jefferson acquired, while in Paris, his copy of the Federalist Papers. This is the period of time when he's actually in Europe. And he, as I mentioned, had actually assisted Madison in the preparation of that document. Many years later, in his proposal to Congress to sell his collection, he talked about the strength of his American holdings. While residing in Paris, I devoted every afternoon, I was disengaged for a summer or two, in examining all the principal bookstores, turning over every book with my own hand, and putting by everything which related to America, and indeed whatever was rare and valuable in every science. Well, if you reread this several times, you realize how Jefferson bought books. He essentially went through the bookstalls of Paris and put aside every book of interest, but not the least of which was a massive amount of Americana. Jefferson did acquire an extraordinary number of books in Paris. Buffon's Natural History was picked up when he was there, as well as Mark Catesby's work on the Carolinas. After purchasing the Encyclopédie Méthodique, Jefferson enlisted himself as a representative for the work, insinuated himself as an author for the next edition, returned back to Virginia and sold subscriptions to unaware planters, and then spent a good deal of time reminding them, dear sir, as a former president at this point, that you've agreed to a subscription. Please follow through. In addition to numerous classical authors, he bought a hodgepodge of editions. Obviously, the underpinnings of the French Revolution seep into Jefferson's collection at this time, but he also picked up Travels and Voyages, scattered authors and titles, History of Peru, Spinoza, Crèvecoeur, Roman law, bibliography, a study of American Indians. He bought Ramsey's History of the Revolution in South Carolina while in Paris. The list is a total frenzy, and it seems like it's nothing more than a bibliographic frolic. And clearly the French book market had a profound impact on Jefferson, not only did it give him the opportunity to elevate his Americana holdings, but to round out the representation of contemporary European thought. It also transformed his entire notion of collecting. All in all, Jefferson purchased over 1,800 books while in Paris in 5 years. And by the time he had returned, he had nearly doubled again his collection. Years later, our friend Cyrus King had something to say about this French influence on the floor of Congress. It might be inferred from the character of the man who collected it, and France, where the collection was made, that the library contained irreligious and immoral books, works of French philosophers who caused and influenced the volcano of the French Revolution, which had desolated Europe and now is extending to this country. This is the argument about whether or not we should acquire Thomas Jefferson's books. Upon returning to America in 1789, Jefferson possessed a library twice the size as the one that he left, and a considerable debt as well. By 1815, the collection had grown to 6,487 volumes, for its time an utterly vast collection, and one that represented a substantial investment, perhaps even an incautious one, even for somebody of Mr. Jefferson's wealth. This is the Jefferson collection as it was known in the Library of Congress until just a few years ago. That is, these are the books actually owned by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson acknowledged that this was likely the largest library available at the time. His great pride in his collection, however, was not in the size, but within the care that he had chosen these items. His endless intellectual curiosity, his worldliness, his keen knowledge of bibliography, his great universal learnedness, and his considerable, though sometimes questionable, means had provided him a unique opportunity to acquire a private library that was truly unrivaled in America. This was to become the Library of Congress. This was the collection that also shaped and informed the Declaration of Independence, that had guided early American diplomacy, that had fueled innovations in American technology, that had inspired the design of Monticello, and that had assisted a Virginia planter. And now this collection that had been built around Jefferson's notion of universal knowledge was to serve as the source of inspiration for the new republic. Jefferson's books began their journey to Washington, D.C., to Blodgett's Hotel, that's the temporary capital, in May of 1815. A large crowd of men walked in, shoved cotton batten around the books in the bookcases, nailed boards over the front of them, tore them off the wall, loaded them into horse carriages, and off they went to Washington, D.C.